Welcome back, Time-Crunched fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Zone 2, LSD, metabolic testing. We've got quite the list of topics for you today. All these topics coming from you, our listeners, by the way. And if you're new to the show, welcome. You've found the podcast focused on all things endurance training and performance wrapped up into a quick, actionable episode. You can write in with any questions that you'd like on these topics at trainwright.com/podcast. And that's where our question comes from today. So let's get right down to it. It's a bit of a longer question, so but it provides really good context. So let me read the whole thing and we'll start chipping away at the answers. All right, here is the original question. It's coming from Andy. I'm working on building my base and have submitted to doing nothing much more than LSD. Not the drug, by the way, but we'll talk about what that means. I'll mix in some higher intensity at the end of some rides, and then even on the 10th ride, I'll make that one with some higher intensity. But mostly everything is 90 minutes and LSD. Long, slow distance or long, slow duration is what he's talking about there, by the way. I had a metabolic test done over the summer, which determined my zone 2 heart rate to be around 120 beats per minute. So I ride at that wattage and just stay under it. Turns out that around 150 watts keeps me in a good range for 115 to 120 beats per minute. So how do I progress this? I would ultimately like this zone 2 power to be closer to 200 watts or better. And how often should I increase my watts in zone 2 rides to work on my zone 2 power increase? Or is that even the correct way to think about it? Currently, I'm on a 5 to 8 week of majority zone 2 riding that I do in the trainer in a good steady state. I tried to ride on the road before and I was willing to give up the outdoor ride. I just can't keep a very good steady state aerobic out there. It's very hilly and my power output is so low that on my current zone 2 that even the slightest incline in the easiest gearing couldn't be or wouldn't be enough to keep my power under zone 2 requirement. So thanks, Andy. Sorry, really had to push through that. It's a long one, but we got there. So really what he's talking about is he wants to improve that cruising aerobic power development, right? A lot of people do. He's in that current zone 2 base and he wants to have all the knowledge in order to do that. My initial response to this was actually, I'm happy that people are thinking about their training differently and making a plan to proactively make some changes to their physiology. Super stoked about it. Glad people are hearing the message. But I also get a little worked up when I hear people sacrificing riding outside for indoor riding just to stick to zone 2 training guidelines, because the message that coaches, athletes, and physiologists are pushing can get a little confusing on this topic. So let's dissect all of this and answer your question directly, Andy, and we'll also hopefully clear up some of the confusion. So first, Andy and folks, when is it appropriate to do mostly zone 2 training? Well, kind of like 3 different periods here. And that's when you're building or reestablishing base, which you mentioned here, Andy. Okay, so that's when you want to do most of your training in zone 2 and not really touch the intensity. Okay. The other time period is when you're trying to improve your fat oxidation or metabolic flexibility. Okay, because you mentioned a metabolic test. You didn't mention the results of that test. However, you mentioned the metabolism. For all of that detail, I'll steer you toward episode number 169 with Coach Renee Eastman entitled Sugar Burner versus Fat Burner. That's where we talk about what fat oxidation is, metabolic flexibility, and kind of that aerobic crossover point where you are burning more carbohydrate than fat. And so when you're trying to change something metabolically, that's also a good time to keep intensity low, stick to zone 2, but it's not really what you're asking for. Okay, in this question from you, Andy. Now, another time period is detraining. Okay, now it's coming toward the end of the season for a lot of people, and that's when we'll bring intensity down. Maybe we just don't even ride for a little while, a week, maybe 2, something like that. And you detrain. You bring CTL down intentionally, and you get rid of a lot of the built-up fatigue mentally and physically from a big season of riding. Okay, and racing and all the other things that go into it. So those 3 scenarios is where I would, bring the intensity down and just do zone 2, but for how long and when and all this kind of stuff. And riding inside is a good way to control the elements to do that. However, be super careful here, folks, because zone 2 riding only doesn't give you some mystical, magical powers. Okay. We're going to talk a lot about that today. But first, let's go to the scenario of when not to do just zone 2 training. Okay. And if you think about that, what I mean here is for time crunch athletes, this is most of the year. Don't hear me wrong now. The majority of your intensity distribution for time crunch athletes, as well as time rich athletes, should be zone 2 endurance for their year-long training program. That means of all the rides that we do all year round, over 50% should be in that zone 2. I would argue 70, maybe 80%, kind of depending on what the program is that you're doing and whatnot. But the majority of our riding should always be endurance riding, zone 2. But for the time crunched athlete, the yearly volume is too low to spend 8 weeks or more focused on zone 2 only, and you'll get a ton more benefit from mixed intensity training throughout the year. Time crunched athletes are not professional athletes doing 20 to 30 hours of training. So don't think that you need to train like a professional athlete for months and months of zone 2 to build your base. As time crunched athletes, we need something different. It's not that you're doing too much zone 2. It's that you're actually not doing enough in order to get the total stress needed to improve your performance and capacity. And when you improve performance and capacity, that's how you'll increase your zone 2 cruising power, your FTP, your VO2 max, and all these other things. So, Andy, to your specific scenario, at some point, 90 minutes of riding 5 to 6 times per week is just not going to build any more fitness or improve your metabolic flexibility any further. You need intensity to move the needle on fitness and performance and your overall physiology. In fact, when I modeled out a fitness build for an example athlete on Training Peaks, let's just call her Jane Doe. And if she's new at starting out, let's just assume 0 CTL, which is never actually true. But in the case of this is a model, so let's run with it. What I did was I built out 90 minutes of riding 5 days per week with 2 rest days in that week as well. At first, she'll build CTL nicely at 3 to 5 TSS per week for the first 7 weeks or so. We call that her ramp rate. After that, her ramp rate will slow down to 1 or 2 TSS per week. At weeks 11 and 12, the ramp rate's only 1. And at week 16, the CTL plateaus around 43 or 44 and no longer increases with 7.5 hours of training at zone 2 per week. And so by using CTL as a model in this example, I would make the argument that if your fitness score on Training Peaks is around 40, okay, plus or minus 5 to 10, something like that, doing 7.5 hours of zone 2 training is not going to build the base of your aerobic fitness any further. And it can actually decrease fitness as it pertains to CTL. For example, if you're coming into this block, Andy, and you had a CTL of 70 and used just 8 weeks of zone 2 riding, 7.5 hours, so 90 minutes of riding 5 days a week, your CTL will go down. Okay. Now there's reasons that you would want to do that, especially like metabolically. Maybe you just want to get away from intensity. Maybe it is your off season. I would say that there's better ways of structuring that 8 weeks. Okay. Really what I'm trying to press in here is there's nothing magical about zone 2 training by itself. There's a lot of other things to consider when you're doing it. And don't think that reducing training load will make you more fit. It will not. If you want to increase your base, you need to put in more hours of total training or lengthen the duration of a long ride on the weekend or any day that works for you, aiming for like 3 hours plus and increasing that to deepen the base. Okay, you need to do something different in order to make big improvements. Or you can use intensity to increase ramp rates, CTL, and aerobic capacity. Now let's talk about progression at zone 2. you don't have to get much more complicated than what Andy laid out here in the way of doing a block of zone 2. Okay. It's basically ride your bike consistently, endurance pace, zone 2 training parameters, all that kind of stuff. And endurance miles or zone 2 riding day after day is the way you do that. Yeah, you can throw in a couple sprints in there and progress the long ride like we talked about every 10 days or maybe even like once a week. That's fine. Andy mentioned every 10 days, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of ways to build base here. In fact, I did a podcast with Coach Coley Moore from Empirical Cycling. It's called A Practical Guide to Base Training, and it's episode number 82. Check that one out for a more structured and I would say kind of better way, or a few creative ideas on how to build base for time-crunched athletes. One thing to touch on here real quick, LSD, long, slow duration or long, slow distance. This only works if you can do the long portion of that. Anybody can go easy, okay? But you need to go long. And you know what? You won't get the total stress that you think you are if you don't go long enough. All of that pertains to like your own individual physiology and all this kind of stuff. If you're new to riding bikes, a 2-hour ride is a long ride, and that will move the needle. If you've been doing this thing for like 5 to 10 years, a 2-hour ride is probably your normal, time crunched weekend sort of ride. And so in that way, don't think that subscribing to LSD training is going to do anything for you. It's not. Okay. One tool that will give a little bit more insight is called aerobic decoupling. Now, this is something that is available for you on Training Peaks, and I go over how to use this metric and all of its nuances in episode number 195 with CTS Coach Renee Eastman. And the title of that is What to Do About Intensity Creep. In simple terms, this is a metric you can use to check in on your aerobic system to see if it's handling aerobic stress appropriately compared to norms that we'd like to see in a cardiovascularly fit person, and making sure that you don't, quote, decouple more than 5% over the course of a steady ride or longer during aerobic ride or threshold ride. There's a lot of noise to this metric, okay, because it involves heart rate and normalized power, okay? And so what it's doing is it's actually looking at the relationship of your normalized power and your heart rate in the first half of the ride compared to the second half. And the way I use it for aerobic or threshold, it should be steady overall. And I would say there's a lot of art that goes on into using it well. Now, I'm not going to get into the details. Again, listen to that podcast with Renee, or I linked to a great article by Coach Joe Friel, who's been on the podcast several times, on how to use this in your training. Check it out in the show notes. The title of the article is called Are You Fit? All About Aerobic Endurance and Decoupling by Joe Friel. In my opinion, I don't think aerobic decoupling tells a full story, ensuring if you are fit, quote unquote, but it can shed some light on your internal strain and durability during those kind of long, steady efforts. And Andy, to you, it can give you some insight on how to test your zone 2 power and see what your heart rate is doing. And if you decouple less over time, that means you are improving. That's how I would use it. Anyway, increasing zone 2 power. People are super into this right now. Two ways I think about it is you can either push it up or pull it up. I say that when you push it up, you do lots of volume. So you're putting, the metaphor is you're putting a lot of hay in the barn. So this is doing higher volume. Okay. For time crunched athletes, we typically say time crunched athlete is like 6 to 8 hours per week on average. If you can nudge it up to 10 hours per week, maybe 12 for a short time period, that's putting hay in the barn. You're pushing your aerobic capacity up. Okay, you're putting hay in the barn for later that you want to use. Okay, that's the full analogy there. So that's when I say you can push it up with lots more volume, or you can pull it up, and that's using intensity or ideally a mix of volume and intensity. And so the best way to do this is using a training principle called progressive overload with mixed intensities. And if you do this right, you'll increase your fitness, you'll increase your FTP, as well as your zone 2 power. Now, a couple things here as it relates to Andy's example. Based on your power of 150 watts, Andy, at your cruising zone 2 power, it's about, let's just say that's the middle of zone 2 for you. That would put your FTP around 220 watts. In order to increase your zone 2 power from 150 up to 200 watts, you'd need to increase your FTP by around 55 or 60 watts. Now, that's 25%. That's realistic, but it's aggressive, but it's realistic. Now, you can't do this unless you significantly increase total volume or increase intensity throughout the week. Bang for the buck, training your glycolytic energy system is the best way to do this, and that's your FTP. We can change FTP by 25% with trained individuals using a solid training program. So for you, Andy, I would focus on increasing your FTP in order to increase not only zone 2 power, but your total performance, your fitness, and capacity on the bike. How I do this in my coaching process is after building base, I build intensity to improve FTP and other performance metrics. I work the aerobic system and the anaerobic side of things throughout the season, and I layer those things together, and I keep on weaving one up and one down to keep fitness and performance building throughout. Between seasons or in that transition phase, I do let some of that go during the detraining phase, but I keep it shorter for time crunched athletes, like 2 to 3 weeks tops. And but I make sure that the CTL doesn't drop too much. And then what I do is I link together those two seasons and keep on layering the fitness and everything else on top of that. Okay. Meanwhile, you keep the ball rolling from there and you try to manage all the curveballs that life throws at you, and that's a tricky one. But for time crunched athletes, I'm not doing 8 weeks of zone 2 only. Let's talk about riding indoors versus outdoor for zone 2 rides. Here's where I'm going to get a little worked up. If you like riding outside, ride outside. I would never sacrifice riding outdoors for indoors in order to keep zone 2 training, unless you're trying to change something metabolically, like I've already mentioned before, or you had some significant time away from the bike and you're starting to rebuild again. Okay, that's another. So you went through transition phase, detraining phase, whatever you want to call it. Now we're just starting to ride again. Or if it's just super cold, rainy, mixed sleet, and the outdoor riding conditions are not conducive to getting some good training done. Okay, no doubt that indoor riding is great for fitness and predictability and control the elements. If you have a good indoor training setup, it's pretty simple just to hop on and start riding. So I'm all in favor of indoor riding, especially from the simplicity aspect of that. But riding outside has a ton, if you like it, right? If you enjoy riding outside, it's got a ton of benefits, including fresh air, vitamin D, engagement with nature, actually learning how to drive and steer and ride your bike. The skill work of cornering, pacing, descending can go away if you don't use it. So I'd encourage many people to keep riding outside and don't stop riding outside just to stick to zone 2. Okay. Now I live in hilly terrain in my zone 2. Can't stay in it. Okay, let's talk about that. Andy, I get your point in living in a hilly area. In fact, I was riding with CTS coach Jim Lehman in Colorado about 4 weeks ago now. And we're talking about this because I have an athlete who lives in Park City, same scenario. Okay, so we were talking about this. And Jim's angle was, doesn't matter that much. Like if you like riding outside, it's fun and you engage with it, doing more, you don't have to get super structured, but just like ride the hills, descend, aim for a flat day once in a while, you'll actually carry that capacity more rather than just basically what he's saying is the mixture of intensities and the engagement with that is going to be just fine. Okay. Cause you're probably up into that zone 3, little mixture of zone 3, and that's certainly not going to hurt you. And if you're just riding to build fitness and things like this, that's totally fine. Now, some tips to try out on my side of things and what I use for my athletes is if you have a mountain bike or a gravel bike, ride that on roads on your zone 2 days. Cause typically we have shorter gears, so easier gears that you can go into a hill and keep it aerobic for longer. Okay. Now, if you have an e-bike, you could use that on your zone 2 days. Another one of my athletes actually, who lives in Park City, he has an e-mountain bike and he does that on his endurance days because it's just super fun. He's out there and keeps the heart rate low, building endurance. Third thing, change out your cassettes. Now, this will cost some money, maybe a couple $100, but read up online, see what your bike can take. You swap the cassette and the chain, and as long as your derailleur can handle it, Swap those out, you get some easier gears and you keep the heart rate and power low as you're riding outside. So I'm glad people are getting the message here on aerobic training. 5 to 10 years ago, I'd be encouraging people to skip the group ride and do some solo endurance work more often. And now it's like, whoa, maybe jump in that group ride, or maybe, hit the intensity more, like I'm saying here to Andy. Okay, but riding your bike should be fun, not something that you're submitting yourself to the zone 2 gods, being pulverized by all the coaches, podcasters, and articles jumping on the most recent bandwagon of training hype. It all comes down to what you're trying to accomplish in your training. I don't have all the background on you, Andy, but I would recommend that, if you enjoy riding your bike outside, and if you haven't taken a ton of time away from training, meaning you still have decent CTL, riding outside 2 to 3 times per week in the hills, hit it however you want, and then do your zone 2 riding inside. That's probably a better combination to keep CTL up there, keep the fun factor up there, change it up, and it'll bring good contrast, variety, and mixture of intensities so that you can keep your fitness and not have to submit to the indoor gods. My main message is, don't throw away fitness thinking that zone 2 only will give you more of it. Because if it's low volume for 8 weeks, it won't. You can actually get less fit. Now, like I said previously, there could be a time and place for this. Proper detraining phase, metabolic training, building base from 0 on upward. But unless it's those 3 scenarios, I'd keep fitness and vibes rolling by keeping some intensity in the mix, riding outside, still do some zone 2 inside, like I mentioned earlier. So in closing, that's it. That's our show for today. Thank you all again for tuning in and listening to our show. And to our audience members like Andy who have written in, thank you. It's great to hear from you and learning what you want to learn more of. Okay. And as we whip up some shows specifically on what you want to hear, it's super fun to be able to connect with you in that way. For those of you with that burning question in mind that haven't asked yet, remember that you can head over to trainright.com/podcast, click on Ask a Training Question, fill out the form, and submit it in. Those get sent directly to me, and I'll do my best to answer it on an upcoming episode. While you're there, you can check out our newsletter or the CTS membership. And if you're curious on how coaching works, you can find more information on how to get started. Our goal is to provide you with every resource possible that you need to improve your performance, your fitness, and have a ton of fun on your athletic journey. Remember to come back next week for more actionable training advice on all things endurance related.